and I'm actually going to invite our director of worship and music forward to offer a reflection. You may or may not know, hopefully you know, Matthew is also has a PhD in philosophy and religion and has done a lot of study on the kingdom parables of Jesus and the kingdom way. And so on this celebration of music Sunday, I invited our director of music to share not a sermon, because he told me he'll never preach a sermon in a church, but a reflection on the kingdom of God in a moment.
Thank you for that. I appreciate very much the invitation to park in the reserved spot for pastors. And I have my iPad here to ensure that I don't get a ticket for staying too long. You know, in graduate school in philosophy, we learn how to talk for 75 minutes, not 12 or something. But that's, by the way, that's not a trigger warning. I'm just telling you that I think I have this under control. The parable for this morning is a story about answers and actions, about what we say and about what we do. Whenever I hear this parable, I'm always reminded of a Spanish proverb that I love. It goes like this: Entre lo dicho y hecho hay un gran trecho. And translated more or less literally, it means between the saying and the doing, there's a long stretch. Right? And we know what that means, right? We know that the proverb is pointing us to the fact that quite often we say things and we don't follow through fully, right? But here's an interesting thing about this parable. The first son in this parable is an illustration that sometimes we're on the right track when we don't follow through with our answer. Remember, he said no, but then he got to work anyway, right? My great-grandfather, Heinrich Friedrich Daude, heard a call like these sons. He answered, and he got to work. HF is what I call him in conversations I have with him in my head. Of course, I've never met him because he was dead long before I was born. But any philosopher, trust me, any philosopher will tell you that when it comes to conversations, death is only a minor inconvenience. So HF was a baker in a small town outside Essen, sort of between Dortmund and Essen. And one day he got a call to become a Lutheran pastor and take up ministry and make a long trek to Texas and become what in his mind was a missionary. So, in a moment, he decided. He left a reasonably secure future as a baker. He went to seminary, he packed his stuff, took his young family across the ocean, came here to Texas, and came here to Texas on a mission to spread a gospel of peace and justice for everyone, right? In a way, HF is not represented in this parable because unlike these two sons, he said yes, and then he also got to work and followed through, right? I had a moment sort of like that. I want to share with you the moment that I became an organist, not in the sense of sitting on the bench and playing, but in the sense of my identity. I became organist at the family church that my great-grandfather, HF, had co-founded when I was 13. And I hated it. I felt like I'd been conscripted. I was most definitely not saying yes to the call. I was a nervous wreck. I mean, a wreck, sweating, frequent trips to the bathroom from Thursday until late Sunday afternoon, every week, except Christmas, when it was 2 weeks straight. Because, you know, there's lots of services to play. That's not the moment. That's my first son moment. I mean, I sat on the bench and played, but I really did not think of myself as an organist. I thought of myself as a prisoner of war. But there came a moment when I was 16. I was invited is a nice word for it. I was invited to play a funeral for the ex-husband of my aunt. in a small rural church here in Texas. So I went out there to play, and I discovered, as I got sort of settled in and met the organ and then met the preacher, that he was a newly called and ordained preacher, like completely green, had never had a ministry before, and this funeral was going to be his very first service. And so we got busy on the service, and the service, all through the service, he sort of avoided the casket. The service was actually unusually brief. And we got to the point, I'm sure all of you can picture this, we got to the point where we had the saying goodbye, the people would file past the casket, I was playing a hymn, we were singing, and the preacher left the altar where he was sort of hovering, came and stood right behind me and leaned down and whispered in my ear, I can't do this, I'm out of here. And then he left through the nearest door, which just happened to be right behind the bench. So people finished filing past the casket. I finished the hymn, which ironically enough was Rock of Ages. So I finished the hymn, and in the place of the preacher who had departed, right behind me was the funeral director. And the funeral director leaned down and said to me, what are we going to do? Because, you know, he was projecting ahead. There would be a graveside ceremony with no preacher. So I looked out at these people. It was a far smaller church than this, but I looked out at these people grieving, even more despondent now that their preacher had beaten a hasty retreat. And suddenly it occurred to me that even at the age of 16, as a veteran of a couple of dozen funerals, I was actually the only person in the room who did know what to do. So I turned to the funeral director. I just want you to picture this. I turned to the funeral director, sort of an elderly man, gray, professional-looking guy. His face was all lined, you know, with all the grief that he had witnessed in his line of work. And I said to him, load the casket while I play the postlude. I'll do the graveside ceremony myself. Now, and here's the most amazing thing about that story. Here's this man, and remember, he's a professional, and the only qualifications I have is a pair of organ shoes. Right? So he just looked me in the eye and said, okay. So I turned back to the organ and I played the postlude, and after the postlude, people had gotten to their cars. I went to my parents' car, and my mom started the conversation we had after every funeral of a non-relative, which was, should we go to the graveside ceremony? Because in her mind, going to the graveside ceremony of somebody you didn't know was like crashing some party, right? So I interrupted the conversation that usually went on quite some time and said, no, we have to go. And then I explained why, and my parents did not utter a single word. My father guided the car into the funeral caravan, and off we went to the cemetery. On the way, I pulled out my little red book of Lutheran rites that I had in my music briefcase, and I even at that tender age, I was experienced enough to know that it was not what the Baptists were expecting, but it was just going to have to do because this was an emergency, right? And I sort of got myself together, got out of the car, headed straight for the tent where all these people were gathering. And I tell you, just approaching, the moods among them were blacker than their suits and hats, because they're like, what's going to happen, right? The funeral director intercepted me on the way, and he said, ready? And I said, yes, I'm ready. And then he handed me the little vial of earth that, I'd always wondered where that came from. And he handed it to me, and so there I was, the Lutheran Book of Rites in one hand and a little vial of earth in the other. So I went over there and did what I thought was a passable impersonation of a Lutheran pastor. And when we got through, to the committal, I comforted people as best I could. And then the graveside ceremony ended, and my father and I were walking back to the car, and he only spoke once, and he said, I do not know how you did that. And at that moment, I responded, I am an organist. And you know what is weird about that moment? The moment that I saw those people, I was overcome with this wave of compassion that overpowered even my hatred of playing in front of people. And from that moment on, I've never been afraid to play or speak, obviously, in front of people again. In a moment, we can change. And these answers and actions take us back to the parable, right? I mean, the call of the kingdom does not always come in words. In fact, often it doesn't come in words or even with religious trappings. The call of the kingdom often appears as someone in need, someone who's suffering, someone who's easy to miss or easy to ignore, right? And in a moment, we decide and we answer. But here's the interesting thing about answers, right? Think about what the sons don't say in their answer. They don't say things like, what's in it for me? Or, how are other people going to think about me if there was none of that. I mean, the focus is really on yes and no, right? So what does that tell us? It's a clue that Jesus is not really interested in answers in this parable. What he's interested in is getting to work. It would have been really easy for HF to say no thanks to the call and stick with this reasonably secure future that he had. It would have been really easy for me to choose my own comfort zone over the needs of that congregation of people, but HF didn't, and I didn't. And you know, a lot of people have said, hearing this story, have said, well, how many 16-year-olds would do that? And I really think that that's got this story by the wrong end, because that makes my Lutheran pastor impersonation something heroic or out of the ordinary. But the truth is, that's not what happened. What happened is I just looked out there and saw what needed to be done, and then I got to work. Now, I wish I could tell you, I really wish I could tell you that I have been true to the kingdom mindset in all the decisions I've made, but of course I haven't. Some have been better than others. But you know what? Isn't that the point of the first son? The point of the first son is that we don't have to give superhuman answers. That's really not the issue. The issue is that we don't give less than human effort in getting to work. That's the center of gravity of this parable. And maybe the whole kingdom mindset comes down to just this. Notice what needs to be done. Get yourself out of the way and just get to work. That's what I think the first son is telling us. We often say no, but in a moment, we can change.